Super. My first act of self-care was to hide self-view. So I'm just seeing all of your faces. To Ruby and Alnor, I'm feeling so inspired, and I feel like so much of what I wasn't sure how to cover or what to cover has just been covered in what you've said. And it leaves me in a slight ground of unknowing where to start. But I think what I'll pick up on is where Alnor left off, which is practice. So yeah, for context, since I was about 12 years old, I've been suffering with long-term chronic fatigue. And it's been a real journey for me to look into what the sources of that are. Some of them are kind of biological, some, lack of exercise, diet, etc., perhaps have gone on that journey. But a big part of it is psychological. Now, some of that is my own personal trauma that I lived through kind of the circumstances of my life, particularly aspects of growing up. But something that really woke me up recently was having the opportunity to hear from a teacher, Thupten Jinpa, who is a former translator for the Dalai Lama. And he used the term casually when he was speaking, which was moral injury. I don't know how many of us have come across that term, but just hearing those words has been really transformative for me. The term comes from studies into kind of PTSD and soldiers, and I'm just going to start timing myself because I promised I would do that. Totally failed. So I don't know how many minutes I've spoken now. But anyway, this term moral injury. Essentially, when something is happening in the world, particularly that we're bearing witness to, that crosses the lines of our values, we suffer a wound as a result of that, especially so if we feel motivated to try to do something about it and are unable to do so. If we're inhibited in our capacity to respond to something we know to be unjust, that is putting a pressure on us. What else is putting a pressure on us is, as we're in this kind of hyper stimulating information age where we're receiving, photographs of refugees washing up on European beaches and rainforests forests across California and Australia just absolutely devastated by fire. We're seeing these images in a way we never would have before. We're coming directly into contact with that suffering. And what that creates is what's called empathic distress. It's where you're resonating with that suffering, but it's just putting you into quite an agitated and uncomfortable state. Now, these two things together, I think, are really important. This sense of moral injury and the empathic distress we receive witnessing suffering in the world, because I don't think our culture does anything at all to really equip us to deal with those feelings. In fact, as Alnor was describing really perfectly, it's in fact found ways to co-opt those feelings and sell us instead suppressive measures, ways that we can distract ourselves with watching X Factor or some kind of competitive thing we might engage our minds on for a while, or some way of boosting our own sense of self and credibility. The problem with that, and you may have seen me scrambling to pull this quote off my wall earlier, but there's a quote here from J.J. Gross, which is that because emotional resonance happens near automatically, avoidance requires an effortful total suppression, blocking vital emotional insights and communication, and requiring effort that is physiologically taxing on our system, resulting in more, not less, exhaustion over time. So just to break that down, the act of suppressing the feelings of despair, of fear, of grief that come up for us as we witness the suffering in the world actually has a compound exhausting effect on us physiologically and psychologically. We're essentially being drained by not addressing the negative feelings we have in response to the world. However, as I said before, if you just enter into trying to witness more clearly what's happening in a way where you don't have a practice to hold that, you're likely to get yourself into one of two different situations. You get this kind of hypo response that I've just mentioned, which is where you kind of shut down and suppress and deny, or you get a hyper response where you're so activated that you'll either completely fizz out and burn out, or you'll feel a kind of chronic need to take action, that I've got to keep doing something, I've got to throw myself into something. And that sense of overcommitment often leads to burnout as well. What we're trying to get to is a middle way where we're neither over nor under stimulated by that stimulus, and we can enter into a kind of intimacy with the situation that we're witnessing. Now, one of the ways that I'm really inspired about in terms of being able to achieve this as a practice is to understand a little bit more about the difference between empathy and compassion. Empathy is something that can happen subconsciously. It merely means the kind of emotional resonance with the state of another. Compassion is different. Compassion requires two more things. One, awareness. You have to have a kind of clarity around what you're seeing. And second, an intention. Now, that's really useful because both of those aspects are psychologically trainable. There's strong evidence that you can cultivate those as states and that those states can become traits over time. What that means is we can begin to start to have practices where when we see triggers in the world that we know are going to bring up difficult emotions for us, if we can start to cultivate a kind of mindful awareness of that in the moment as it's happening and remind ourselves that what we want is to see that suffering alleviated, we gain a new way of relating to that suffering that actually has been shown by Tanya Singer and various others in terms of neuroscience to activate very different parts of the brain associated with motivation. And it's reported to be, by people who practice this, and actually a very energizing state. So instead of having this experience of seeing some immediate trigger and feeling panicked by it, feeling shocked and kind of thinking it's horrible and then trying to run away from it in some way, shape or form, for me, it's often reaching for some kind of chocolate biscuit or snack or something to kind of satiate myself. If we can instead use that as an opportunity to trigger a moment of awareness, call up that sense of wanting to care for, wanting to relieve that situation, we can find ourselves lifted and inspired. And I'm very excited about what that could mean in terms of mass movements encompassing those practices and a different society coming about. Thinking again of what Alnor was saying about how this system self-selects the people that are most appropriate for it. One of the attributes of those people is the people who care the least, the people who have become most effective at suppressing their own emotional responses. That kind of psychopathic nature of the system that was referenced is literally meaning people who have no empathy. So if we can begin to raise our own capacity, essentially for love, to respond lovingly to the world, we're lifting the love quotient of any system. And the more love there is present within that system, the more that love will be having an active effect within that system. Now, it's been well demonstrated how effective the system is at co-opting and maneuvering around, but I'm really inspired by the work of Joanna Macy, who talks about the different kinds of actions we need to kind of overthrow the system that we currently have. We need holding actions. That's like people like the indigenous activists trying to stop Line 3 at the moment, the Tar Sands project. We need kind of prefigurative actions of people showing new ways of doing things. I think some of the work that Alnor's doing is about kind of actually engaging with communities and modeling the way we want things to see. But this final piece is about a shift in consciousness. And that might sound like something dramatic and woo-woo and, you know, a bit kind of out there, but it's actually something very simple. It's about our own mental habits of how we respond to the world and what values we're able to cultivate and offer on a moment-by-moment basis. So I'm not sure, I'm probably running to time, but I'd just like to take one breath with you all. A simple practice I've been using whenever I try to notice that something's affecting me is just to follow the in-breath and the out-breath. And with the in-breath, as we breathe in, just acknowledge that this is suffering. This is suffering I am witnessing. And as we breathe out, just send towards that suffering situation whatever you feel might be of help. Sending that wish along with the breath. This is a practice we can use multiple times a day. And as we cultivate it, we'll deepen and deepen and start to habituate that as our natural instinctive response when triggers come up. I'm excited to talk more about this, but I think I'm more than probably at time. Thank you.